10x your service design offering with Smapply. Take 20% off any order with This Is HCD 20 off. Let's superpower you and your design team's potential. Sign up at smapply.app. Enjoy the episode from your friends at Smapply, helping support This Is HCD podcast.
Welcome to Worldwide Waste, a podcast about how digital is killing the planet and what to do about it. The website Carbon Calculator is a real go-to tool for me when I want to find out how much CO2 a particular web page is creating. This and many other great initiatives come from Whole Grain Digital, a company founded by Vanita and Tom Greenwood in 2007. Tom has recently published an excellent book, Sustainable Web Design, From a Book Apart. I wanted to know how Vanita and Tom got started so early in promoting a culture of sustainable web design.
Yeah, well, if I'm being honest, so when we started the business, which was 2007, we were very much sort of moving into digital as a as a panacea to environmental problems. So, Vanita was an electronics engineer, and I was an industrial designer in a kind of, traditional product design sense, sort of physical things rather than digital things. And we were both sort of, really concerned about the manufacture, the use, disposal of, so much physical stuff, and really looking at digital as a potential solution to that. In how can digital enable us to do the things that we all want to do in life, and provide useful services, improve quality of life, whatever it might be, without needing to actually, dig up the Earth's resources and spew out pollution and then throw waste into landfill sites. And so that's what really kind of started us down this track of being a digital agency and being focused on sustainability, trying to look at that in every aspect of the business. But because that was our focus, gradually over time, we sort of started asking, well, yeah, but what about the digital bit? Like, surely there must be an impact to that. And, we originally naively kind of went in thinking that there wasn't really an impact to digital. That was part of the attraction. And everybody we asked over the years, whenever we brought it up and sort of asked people who we thought might know about it, and they sort of said, oh, well, no, it's insignificant. Don't worry about it. It's almost nothing. And that's still, still the case in a lot of places today within our industry, because it's not really talked about still. But gradually over time, we sort of picked away at it and started finding information that showed that actually the impact of digital is really big. And yes, there is a huge role for digital to help us kind of solve environmental problems and reduce impact relative to some things that were previously, physical products and services. But that doesn't mean that digital itself doesn't have an impact. I think it was around 4 or 5 years ago when I sort of found an article that was quite recent at the time that sort of was looking into the impact of data centers specifically, comparing that to sort of the electricity consumption of the whole of the UK. That was sort of really a wake-up call. I thought, hang on a minute. I mean, data centers are only a part of the puzzle. And yet, equivalent energy consumption to sort of what the world's 5th or 6th biggest economy. I mean, that's absolutely insane. So yeah, that was sort of really how we got looking into this.
Very interesting, both your backgrounds, from the physically designed type of product, so to speak. And I think, yeah, that you've summarized, I think, certainly the way I would have felt. Like, I've been involved in the web since the mid-90s, and I don't think I thought very much one way or another. But if I did think, I would have thought, hey, digital is great, digital is sustainable, e-books are much better than physical books. So that would have, and I would say that's anybody in, or the most people in digital, that would be their de facto thought if they are to think about it. So you said the data center, you coming across that data center, and then you're thinking, oh, there's much more than data centers. And the interesting thing, I suppose, is with with data centers is that, been reading some articles recently, that their electricity usage, even though their usage and expansion has grown very substantially, the quantity of electricity they're consuming has not increased very, very much, because they are quite energy efficient for what they're doing, so to speak. So, but it's a kind of, what struck me when I was doing the research is that, I saw all this stuff like from the 70s onwards, that basically modern digital, so to speak, took off. There were mainframes in the 70s. It wasn't the 80s until the PC, but computers really began to take off at the beginning of the 70s. What I noticed was as well that all the other really negative metrics took off as well. Species extinction, tremendous extraction, etc. And I wondered, like, what is there a relationship? I thought, and I think, yeah, there is, because those oil wells, those machines, without that computer modeling, without that computer-aided design, without that data coming back, we could have never built these extractive technologies. In many ways, digital became an accelerant, very negative human behaviors, that in and of itself, it wasn't necessarily energy inefficient. But I've often talked about over the years about in content, and I said, before content, before the CMS, we used to have a shovel, and now we got a digger. And that, it may be a very efficient digger, but it's still allowing us to flood the space, with all these other things. So I kind of, you see this hidden hand of digital, or have you noticed that, or is that part of your thinking as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the thing, that the digital is sort of pervasive, in our society now, and it can very much be used for really positive things. But I think you hit the nail on the head when you said it's an accelerant of consumption. That it's an incredibly powerful tool, both in allowing us to figure out how to do more things, manufacture new technologies, extract more resources. But it's also an accelerant in enabling people and encouraging people to consume those resources, through, digital marketing and e-commerce. It just makes it so easy and for us to consume ever more and more. And I think that is actually a big part of the debate that isn't talked about that much. That, I think digital transformation is this sort of magical term that it sort of suggests that we'll turn everything digital and it'll solve all of our problems.
Yeah.
And, it can solve many problems, but not by default. I always say that digital is kind of neutral in it's kind of neutral in whether it's good or bad by default. Whether it has a good or a bad impact is very much dependent on what we use it for. But the trouble is that we use it for both. We use it to solve real problems, social problems, environmental problems, but we also use it to create new problems. And I think in many ways, we use it more for the latter.
You've touched on a couple of profound things there in that talk. One, which really has disturbed me in the last number of years, and, making things easy to use. I thought that was a kind of the holy grail, but you've articulated a kind of a potential dark side of it too. And the other about the neutrality of these tools. And, I suppose if you, because what you say, or what we both said about digital being an accelerant, something that accelerates, something that increases speed, is that necessarily neutral? Or, when we know the laws of physics, that beyond a certain speed, energy consumption really jumps at an exponential level. So, the energy to take a rocket outside of the Earth's orbit is absolutely enormous. Well, there's various reasons, but you have to get tremendous speed and momentum to break through. And that once you go over certain speeds, the energy consumption is enormous. And if an essence of digital is speed, then maybe it's not neutral. Maybe it's leaning on the side of high energy consumption.
Yeah, well, you may well be right there, because I mean, as I said, that I feel that we tend to use it a lot more for the latter, in terms of more for things that cause destruction than solve it, and that may well be part of it, because its key property is speed. That's what it does. It makes everything faster and easier, and by making things faster and easier, human nature is to consume more of it because it's easier for us to do so. So yeah, I mean, in that sense, it's actually a really interesting question you're asking, because yeah, anything that makes it easier for humans to consume resources is likely to lead us to consume more resources. And yeah, that's a conundrum, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Like these are uncomfortable, things, or I find it uncomfortable to, like, the easy use. That's been my whole message, or a key message. I've been all over the world preaching that, and then I began to read, like, some things maybe they shouldn't be so easy, because I think what digital has is that speed, but also that instability kind of in it as well. That by its nature, it morphs and changes, and I see about the instability. I think when you think of instability and you think of I've got a physical book library. I've never had the urge to buy a copy of every book I have just in case my physical library goes on fire.
Yeah.
I say, well, if it goes on fire, it goes on fire. You're just going to have to live with it, right? But I've got about 10 copies of my digital, so to speak, libraries. I've got them on multiple hard disks. I've got them on archives. I've got them on Dropbox. Because of my paranoia that digital is so unstable that I
Yes.
must create multiple copies. So I think when you combine instability or this morphiness, you all sorts of things, like also that we don't think ahead nearly as much anymore. Like, if you want to build a chair from some wood, you got to figure out what sort of wood, how much wood should you have. But with digital, we say, we can always change it.
Yeah.
So we kind of just get stuck in, so I think there are these characteristics of digital that lead to very wasteful type of behaviors that don't seem to require much need for planning, so to speak, or thoughtfulness, or deep thought, certainly long-term thoughtfulness.
Yeah, definitely. And everything's so. I think distraction is another kind of key aspect of that, because so much of the sort of the software that we use day to day now, whether it's for work, things like email and Slack, or whether it's personal, social media, so much of it is designed to distract us and keep pulling us into what's popped up right now, that it is very hard to actually have quiet time for contemplation and thought and planning the long term, because everyone's minds are just constantly being pulled back into the immediate. Even if the immediate is completely trivial, quite irrelevant, it's nevertheless where we now tend to spend most of our mental energy.
And I suppose it's recognizing these things and being aware of these traps, like it's like an addiction. We can enjoy alcohol, have a good time, but we can become addicted, and that sense of, as you say, whether it's on Twitter or LinkedIn or Slack or whatever, of these little pings and these little notifications, they are, as you say, deliberately designed, like Pavlov's dogs, to want us to hit that bell to get a reward.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, again, what you were saying about the backups of backups of backups, I think it's not just instability. It's sort of it's something that comes from, I think, the inherent nature of it being intangible. Like, you can't hold it. So there's a part of you that doesn't really believe that it exists. You can't feel like you trust it 100%, because you've never held it in your hand. You've never seen it with your own eyes in a physical sense. Like, you've seen it on a screen, but that's just a sort of a temporary picture of something. And so I think, there is this sort of inherent distrust of the reliability, even if it is as reliable as having a paper copy that you might lose, or or your dog might eat, or might catch on fire, or get destroyed in a flood, or whatever it is. It might be in practice just as reliable, but it doesn't feel it, and so we end up creating backups. And yeah, there's many different angles to it that I think make us create more and consume more, and it's sort of an ongoing cycle, really.
And is there any way, is that an area you get into with your clients, or a kind of the behavioral part, or have you thought about that area of how to, because another thing connected with that is that not alone do we store, but we store what we don't need to store.
Yeah.
Like we store stuff that if we had it physically, we'd throw in the bin, but we kind of, I keep it anyway, you'd never know, or, it's so easy to store it. We don't have to think about making the decisions of, should I bin this or not? So, we keep way more, and we keep it in multiple places. Have you approached that as a company, or do you stay very much, in a space of design, of digital design, or have you looked at behavior, how we get good behavior within a digital space?
I mean, yes and no. So we do primarily stick within the realm of sort of design and development, to the client's brief. I think there's various different ways that we sort of bring in some of those concepts. One is, just in the design process in general, about, just the whole exploration of what the whole purpose of the project is about and what it's trying to encourage people to do, because I think this question inherently ties in with the whole concept of, user behavior and user experience design. And not just that, but also like the inherent motive of a project, which is something that I think in itself needs to be questioned. Like, what is it? If a website exists and somebody's paying money for it to exist, then they want something out of that. They want to have an impact on the world in some way, or an impact on people in some way. So I think starting from the absolute base of questioning what that is, and whether that's something that you want to be involved in facilitating, is definitely something where we do get involved. But then I think once we're into that process, then to be honest, generally we are in the mindset of enabling, trying to create the fastest path from somebody arriving to somebody achieving the desired goal. And it's an interesting question as to whether that's always a good thing. I mean, I certainly think from the content editing point of view, then it's an easier conversation around the kind of the dynamics of actually good housekeeping. And, then that's a conversation that can be had. It's not necessarily easy to manage, in the sense that clients are sort of, they run their own websites day to day. They manage their own content, but it's certainly a conversation that's relatively intuitive to have, and they can understand and see that there may be a benefit. Whether they feel it's worth their time is different. And I think one of the questions for us, but also for anybody that kind of builds content managed websites for people, is how can you make the deletion process as easy as the creation process?
Yeah.
And I'll be honest with you, that's not something that we've really found a great answer to at the moment, because whenever we talk about it, we always find there's weird edge cases that mean that it's not always as simple as it looks. But for example, we just did it last week on a client's website, just ran a script that basically looked for all of the pages that aren't referenced. They're not linked to from anywhere else. They're not linked to from a navigation or from another page, to find things that maybe used to be used but are no longer, so that we could delete them. So there is stuff like that. But it's very much one of those secondary things. It's not the primary thread of what we're doing, and part of that is simply because the primary thread of what we're doing is what we're being paid to do. And I think this is where the whole kind of the economics of waste sort of come in, because or the economics of consumption, because people inherently want to spend money on things that is going to going to get them something, and that, I don't mean get them something in a bad way. It's sometimes getting something could be a good thing in sense, could be funding for a charity or something like that. But that kind of housekeeping thing is very much sort of more seen more as an overhead, I'd say.
Yeah, it is definitely. Have you had any thoughts or projects? You see the way now traceability is becoming a bigger issue in the physical world to do with food quality, but also sustainability and issues of, you can do a map of everything that went into creating this T-shirt and how much CO2 it created. A number of clothing companies are beginning to do that. Maybe not many, but some, and there's a movement happening. Have you ever tried that or seen that happen in digital, that you can trace back how much effort went into this form, everything from the meetings to the sign-offs to the, or this image or the total carbon that went into creating this new website? So we had 120 hours of meetings, we had we had blah, blah, blah. The total CO2 for this website was, or the total CO2 for this video was, or the, obviously made up. Have you seen any movement in that, or at any of, because there's a kind of leading us into a little bit the website carbon calculator, but at a, this broader holistic picture of all the various things that go into, getting a piece of content approved, et cetera, and all that goes into that. Because I think a lot of organizations don't realize how much effort goes into 500 words of content.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is something we've discussed actually, but it's not something that we've got to yet. But I did have an interesting chat with Chris Adams from the Green Web Foundation, because he was working on a sort of a template of how this might be done from exactly the point of view that you're saying. And so it's been on my mind since I had that conversation with him about how would this translate into the work that we do at Wholegrain. And I think it's one of those things where on the one hand, it's not fundamentally difficult. We already work out our company carbon emissions. It's very easy to then work out like what that is per hour and then factor that in. What's not so simple is the question of billable versus non-billable hours, in the sense that a client is directly paying for a certain amount of our time that's directly spent on their work, and so quantifying the impact of that time, and together, with additional travel and so on, I think would be quite easy. Where it becomes a more complex question is then how you factor in all the non-billable time, the admin time, members of staff who don't directly serve clients, they're not directly working on clients' projects, but they are there to ensure the smooth running of the company and good service to the clients. And how do we factor that in? And as I said, I don't think it's fundamentally difficult. It's just, it needs a bit of brain space to sit down and work out exactly how to sort of create a simple formula that would be representative, that we could then scale, for each piece of work.
And I think the other part of the jigsaw there is the client's time. Like if we're looking at the total CO2 emissions, like I was dealing with a client there about 6 months ago where they had a 50-person email CC discussing a hero shot. Like, I mean, they shouldn't have been discussing it at all. It was an appalling hero shot that was totally irrelevant, and it was a health environment, and they didn't need it. They shouldn't have had this at all. But there was 50 of them.
Yeah.
On this email train going back and forth, so it's, of course, it's your cost, the admin, the directly working, but oftentimes sometimes you factor in the management costs and on their side and their effort and stuff like that, that adds a fair bit to the equation as well.
Yeah, massively. And I think that's actually a lot harder to work out, because you often don't know how much time they've really spent. In that example, there's many people copied into an email, but you don't really know how many of them spent time looking at it or how much time.
Exactly.
And we've also had interesting cases where sometimes it feels like doing the right thing in terms of, like being a sustainable business is great, but sometimes it can feel like there's an element of creative accounting, even if unintentional, because you're never covering the full picture. So, for example, we have a no-fly policy at Hograin, which means that we don't fly for business, and that helps a lot in us reduce our emissions. But we've had a few occasions, not many, but we've had a few occasions where clients flew to see us, and then it feels like, well, what did we gain there? Probably what we gained is that we created a little bit of a barrier, which meant that, probably on balance, there's a lot less flying happening for our projects than if we didn't have that policy. That's definitely true. But on those occasions where it happens that way round, that they say, okay, if you're not coming to us, we'll come to you. It's great to see them in person. It's lovely. But it does sort of, of defeat the point in that sense.
Well, as you say, to an extent, but probably on balance, there's less flying.
Yeah.
And as we know, nothing is ever even close to perfect. We do the best we can, and we learn as we go, and we keep trying heading roughly in the right direction.
Yeah.
But, it's a great policy. It's, but the law of unintended consequences sometimes can occur. But I think on balance there, as you've said, I think probably definitely less flying because of that sort of thinking. Just in, now the area of, because I've used your website carbon calculator many, many times, and it's a very powerful way of, just expressing something, ringing a bell or turning a light on, but the way its core figures, I'd like you to explain that a bit, because, when, as we're looking at these, we're talking about this traceability or total cost, the people think, the actual cost of transferring the data is not that great, etc. But there are far more things in the total cost or the total, that contribute to, that is connected with that gigabyte or that amount, that quantity of data. Maybe just to talk about that sort of the bigger picture of what's involved in a web page and its interlinked potential to create pollution.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think one of the things that's important to state up front is that every website is going to be different in terms of like the exact places that it's using resources. And I think, that's a challenge in itself, just the fact that the web is so distributed that knowing the exact details of any specific website is always going to be an incredibly hard challenge, even if it's your own website, but especially if you're looking at other people's. But nevertheless, if you look at it kind of in a broad sense, then yes, you've got the data transfer, but data, even that, some people look at just data transfer as like how much energy does it take to transfer a gigabyte of data over the internet. But then even if you don't open it up much further, the question is, well, how far are you transferring it? Are you transferring it on a kind of relatively small network from one node to another, or are you transferring it over hundreds of thousands of miles, crossing oceans? That makes a difference in terms of the amount of energy that's used to get from the data center to the end user who's looking at that, and vice versa for any data that comes from the end user to go all the way back again to that data center. But then that's just looking at the data transfer within the internet. You've got the actual energy used within the data centers themselves, which, as we've talked about, can be considerable.
Yeah.
And there's lots of things that you can do to reduce that energy consumption. So some websites are going to use a lot more than others to achieve, relatively the same thing. But, a big proportion of sort of the overall energy is used at that data center level. And then you've got the end user devices, which are using energy themselves and use more energy to process certain things. You can tell when your device gets hot or the fan starts whirring on your computer looking at a web page. It's because it's really making it work hard, and your battery life decreases as a result. And then you've also got sort of local networks, which are out once it reaches your home or your office or wherever you might be, at an airport or train station or whatever, you've got those local networks with the local, Wi-Fi hubs and routers and so on, which are whirring away 24 hours a day using energy. So there's lots of different places beyond just that very simplistic starting point of like how much energy does it take to make a gigabyte of data go over a wire. Once you expand your view out, there's lots of different places that not only are there other places where the energy is being used, but there's lots of different variables that can impact whether that's a lot or a little. And then you can go even further, which is actually looking at, how much energy does it take to build this infrastructure and build the hardware that's actually running the internet. And I think that's something that again is something that really isn't talked about enough, because I mean, the carbon footprint of a server itself is pretty huge, and data centers could be replacing the servers every 3 to 4 years in a lot of cases. And yes, they'll do a lot of work in that time, but nevertheless, that's a lot of computers that are basically being manufactured every few years. We're having to manufacture more, and then at the end of life, they're basically just getting binned, in many cases shredded. So even if they still work, which is even more painful. So, yeah.
Why do they do that for security reasons, or? It's
a mixture. So part of it's for security. So I was talking to somebody recently who was talking about HSBC, and they're shredding thousands of hard drives a week. But in terms of the servers, it's partly security, but it's mainly performance, in the sense, and reliability. So once they get to a point where the warranty has expired, and especially if there's a sort of a performance gain in the new versions, then often they'll just be replaced even if there's nothing wrong with them, because uptime is kind of the name of the game in the hosting industry. So having things out of warranty, you don't want thousands or hundreds of thousands of servers out of warranty running in your data centers, because it's sort of, from a business point of view, could be seen as an accident waiting to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's scary, isn't it? I mean, that's connected with the 50 million tons of e-waste we're creating a year. And as you indicate, and as I kind of knew it to some degree, but hadn't really thought about in the data center context, that a lot of these are perfectly good machines that are being deliberately just shredded.
Yeah, absolutely.
When they could be put to good use in some other environment, as in schools or universities or whatever. And
yeah,
that's another ball game, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I was talking to TechBuyer recently, who are a company that refurbishes hardware from data centers, and I think they're pretty ahead of the game in terms of the industry, but still they refurbish, a very tiny percentage of the industry's waste. But, they were explaining to me how nearly everything that's coming out of these data centers is either, most of it is perfectly usable, and the stuff that's not is actually very easy to repair. They can do it profitably. And the failure rate, they told me, according to their own tests, the failure rate on the refurbished machines is actually lower than on the brand new machines, which is bizarre. But so this whole idea of like, we don't want machines that are out of warranty is kind of crazy. And apparently the reason that the failure rate is so low is because when they refurbish them, they test every single key component of every single machine. Whereas when they manufacture the brand new ones, in the HP factory or the Dell factory or whatever it is, often the same factory with different stickers on them, they're batch testing, so that, they may be every 20th machine or 10th machine that's coming off the production line is getting run through a few tests. And they're saying, yeah, that's fine, but the rest of them actually have never been tested. Whereas when they're refurbished, because they've got to make sure it works in order to resell it, which is weird that it's profitable to make a business out of refurbishment with a higher, more rigorous level of testing than the original manufacturers. It is very, very strange.
But isn't it this intense culture of waste that the tech industry is built on? Like that its whole economics is waste, from planned obsolescence. That's what Apple and Samsung are built on, is planned obsolescence. finding ways to get you to change your phone every 2 years. There is this really insidious underbelly of the economics of waste in tech.
Well, this is it. That people like Hewlett Packard, for example, they don't have a business. They haven't developed a business model in refurbishment of servers for data centers. Their business model is selling you the servers in the first place. So if they give you a 3 or 4 year warranty and they've designed the servers so that some component will probably fail between the 4th and 5th year, you only need one single point of failure, then it makes sense that people would think, yeah, okay, when the warranty's up, we'll replace them with brand new ones. But that's terrible from an environmental point of view. And the only winner is the manufacturer, really. I mean, even the data centers themselves would be better served by a business model that provided them with long-term reliability.
Yeah, and that, as you say, then there's a larger architecture of the internet. One of the things you were talking about there about data transfer, you mentioned wire, and of course, the mechanism by which we transfer the data has a major impact on the energy consumption. If we go to the extreme cases now of 5G, where it looks like they'll have to set up 10 to 30 times the amount of base stations that they had for 4G or 3G to allow 5G to achieve these sorts of speeds that it's claiming it will achieve. Like all of this will require a massive supra infrastructure, to get us what?
Well, that's it. And it's not just the energy of powering those base stations, it's the environmental impact of manufacturing them and, digging up the roads and installing them, and the concrete for the foundations of those poles that they're going in. All of this matters when you scale it over the whole world.
So anything that I suppose begins to help identify or isolate this broad, because it is I bought it for 20 years that digital was green. I think digital has done a fantastic job of hiding its underbelly, or hiding all this other stuff that happens underneath. And like, as I was saying about, say, fast fashion, which is an extraordinarily damaging, nasty industry, that it couldn't exist without Instagram.
Yeah.
Certainly to the extent, nor could it exist without the MacBook, because you can't do 24 seasons with pencil and paper. Many times, like, we've gone from about 2 seasons a year in fashion to 24 in some environments in about 25 years. And the only way you can do that is with computers and networks and being able to modify a design within a day, blah, 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 and make it look that bit different.
Absolutely. And to be able to have teams, in different places around the world that are collaborating on making that happen, with people in sort of Bangladesh, manufacturing, and the people doing the design might be in the US or the UK or somewhere completely different, and sort of making those design changes at such a pace, which just wouldn't be possible in the past. You'd have had to have prepared your designs and packaged them up and in a big roll of paper in a cardboard tube and sent it off to Bangladesh for them to examine and then wait for them to send you some feedback. Whereas now it's just sort of almost real time.
Exactly. But let's say we're coming near the end. Let's end more positively. Because when you're giving guidance, or when you're giving, like, I was talking to a group of banks this morning in Norway, a kind of more social, smaller banks out in the countryside, who were coming together in a kind of collaborative effort to reduce waste in a general sense, but also interested in the digital space. And they were saying, "Whoa, God, we hadn't thought about this," and and then they said, "Where do you start?" Yeah. If somebody's coming to you and saying, in general, Tom, how do we become a more sustainable digital environment as an organization? where do we start? What's the first things we should really look at doing if we want to reduce the waste and just do better for life and for the planet and for general sustainability? Where would you point them to?
Sure. I mean, I guess there's two obvious places just from my own kind of where I sit. I mean, one of them is websites from the point of view of, that's what we do. Hence, I know it best, and that's why I'd point people there. But I think, especially if you're in an organization that uses the web heavily and has a high traffic, then there's a real tangible impact there, and it's a single thing that you can focus on and make a meaningful difference, which I think is why it's a good place to start. But I think the other obvious one is email, because every organization is using email prolifically, and I think that there's an opportunity there to not just sort of have an environmental benefit by using email in a more considered way, but I think that can also help organizations function better, because I think email is a massive distraction, and it's great that we can all communicate, with each other, often over long distances, especially this year with the whole pandemic and so on. But actually, I think it gets in the way of doing deep and meaningful work a lot of the time. And so I think it's really worth, from an organizational culture point of view, trying to look at, like, okay, how can we use email more mindfully? And I think that has a human benefit, organizational benefit, and environmental benefit.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to backtrack there a little bit first. So I'm going to come back to email now in a minute, but the web. So the website. So what would you? So if this, okay, we want to focus on a website. What should it be? What is it? Average web page weight? Should you be looking at a specific target of average weight or download time, or should we be looking at having a good review process to get rid of old content? What would be a couple of really starters in that typically websites are not doing?
Yeah.
That if they started doing would have some real tangible benefits.
Yeah. Well, I think exactly as you said, I think looking at the transfer size of your web pages is a really good starting point, just to kind of understand where you are. Like the median for the web now is somewhere around 3 megabytes for a web page, which is huge when you think about it kind of in a historical context. A floppy disk, for anybody old enough to remember them, was, I think, 1.4 megabytes, and you could fit a whole software program, sometimes multiple
exactly.
games on one
systems.
floppy disk,
Exactly. I remember the 7-inch we had for companies. First company I worked with, our entire accounting system was on.
Right, there you go.
All the accounts,
exactly, yeah. And I think things like that are important to highlight, just how much a megabyte is in terms of the potential of what you can do with it, and therefore 3 megabytes for like the median web page is really huge, because most web pages are not doing that much. They're just text and a few images on a page.
Could you give us an example of, and you don't have to say you could say client X. So client X came to us and their median size was 3 megabytes or 4 megabytes, and after working with us, we got it down to X, and it just worked, and it worked just as well. Is there any rough? You don't need to name a client, but say, to give a sense of how much improvement is actually in there without giving up anything in relation to, it still looked pretty much the same site, so to speak. Would you have any sort of that can give a sense of, I should be trying to get it down to, or I could easily look to get a megabyte off it, or any sort of guidance there in the sense of?
Absolutely. So, I mean, as a general rule, you could almost, no matter what you're doing, unless you've got unless you need to have some sort of, unless you need to have some sort of video stream or something, which, maybe there's a use case where you do, but for a typical web page, there's no good reason why it shouldn't be under a megabyte. I think that's a good starting point. in many cases, it's relatively easy to get it down to sort of 500 or 600 kilobytes. And if you really, really try, you can create, pretty attractive web pages that function really well for under 100 kilobytes. I think the smallest we've ever done was sort of 25, something like that. And, there's reasons why, from a commercial point of view, that many people might need a bit more than that, but you could create a good web page for 100 kilobytes. And I think that's really important to remember. What starts happening is it's the invisible extras that often then cause things to start creeping. It's people, you might create a great website and it's like 99 kilobytes, but then what can happen is that you then add various tracking scripts to the page, and in each tracking script, they vary in size, but you could easily end up with 500 kilobytes of tracking scripts if you're not careful, which is crazy. We were looking at a site last week for somebody, and they were asking us, they'd done loads of stuff in-house with a little bit of guidance from us up front. They'd done loads of stuff in-house to try and make their web pages more efficient, and they'd worked with the design team and the development team to try and improve the efficiency, and they'd done a really nice job. And they came back and they were like, but it's still, our page weight is still so high, and we don't understand why. And we had a quick look and we said, well, it's because your CMS is adding 1.2 megabytes of tracking scripts. Doesn't matter what you do. That's just, it's like it's built into your CMS, and but these tracking scripts are always added. And, so there are things like that really can trip people up.
And here's the thing as well, is, I don't know whether it's your experience, but my experience, most of this tracking is useless. It's not the actual decisions that get made based on the collected data of this quote unquote tracking rarely lead to anything positive. They're collecting all this stuff, 9 out of 10 organizations I deal with, and they either don't know how to use the data, or they do stupid things to kind of increase weird metrics, that they've somehow convinced themselves about engagement or stuff like that, or in the process that if anything, the data that often comes back from this tracking leads to counterproductive behavior within the organization rather than positive behavior. But broadly speaking, a lot of this tracking is of no real benefit.
Yeah. I mean, I have a sort of perhaps a slightly unpopular view that 90% of websites don't need Google Analytics.
Exactly. Well, I totally agree with. I 100%. I've been looking at analytics since 1997, 98, web trends, etc. And I don't know how many meetings I've been in over the years, either with websites I was responsible for, or whatever, where people sat around trying to look intelligent and trying to say intelligent things on Monday morning about the web metrics. And really, it being an exercise in bullshit of, I see the bounce rate has gone up by 3%, or this or that or the other, and that actually meaningless, warbly garbage, exactly the 90% of websites don't need this. You don't need Google Analytics because there's nothing you're going to do different next week.
Well, that's it. I mean, I would say, I'm pretty sure every single one of our clients' websites has analytics on it, whether it's Google Analytics or something, or an alternative. And some of them look at their analytics, some of them do something with it, but there's a lot that don't. But if you have the conversation with them around, well, maybe we should remove it, it never succeeds, because there's always this fear of, but what if we need the data? It's a just in case kind of thing. Well, shouldn't we have it just in case we need it for something? Fear of missing out, really.
If you're interested in these sorts of ideas, please check out my book, Worldwide Waste, at gerrymcgovern.com. To hear other interesting podcasts, please visit thisishcd.com.